You might be wondering, how did I create this retro style 3D chrome effect in Procreate from a sketch? In this video, I'll walk you through my entire design process from start to finish, from using reference photos to creating sketches in my sketchbook and transferring that over to the iPad to create the final piece in Procreate. While the design style is not my own, I followed along with an online course on the Domestika platform. This is from Aurelie's course, Designing 3D Letters in Procreate, which shows you how to recreate vintage car logos. I've been a big fan of Aurelie's lettering work for a few years now. I love her use of bold colors, a bit of vintage-inspired design elements. Definitely check out her work on Instagram. She creates the most enticing reels of her work. And check out her YouTube tutorials to see how she creates some of her lettering pieces. I'll leave both of those linked down below. And now, let's get started with how I created this. First, you want to look for and gather some reference photos. I used Pinterest for this. Here are some examples of lettering styles that helped inspire some of the letter forms I created for my project. I created a separate board for this. If you're curious, this is the Pinterest board Aurelie shared in the class of a collection of retro chrome car logos to give you a sense of the types of script lettering, but also for reference on how to recreate this chrome effect. So use something like this to really study the shadows and the highlights to recreate a realistic effect. Next, you'll want to choose a word that you will letter. At first, I wasn't sure which word I wanted to choose. So in my sketchbook, you can see I tried out a few different ideas. So here in this spread, you can see other words I was considering, from wonder, wander, believe, stranger, eventually, and never. One thing I was looking for were flourishes that I could add either to the capital letters or to descenders like in the G or Y. I decided to go with the word wander, and I just created these with a colored pencil, rough sketches. While you could take a photo or scan your sketch and redraw directly in Procreate, instead what I did was I just looked at it and then drew it from scratch to recraft each letter individually in Procreate. Now we're in Procreate, and you can see my file has a lot of different layers. So I'm going to walk you through how I created this. Included in the course are a set of brushes she created to help recreate the artwork. And one of these is the dotted grid brush, which is actually a very helpful brush. Essentially, it turns your canvas into a dotted grid paper, which is useful for composing letterform sketches. So in order to recreate that, you have the black background, and then on a separate layer with white, using that dotted grid brush, you would just paint over the entire canvas to add the dotted texture. Super helpful. Next, on a separate layer, using a pencil sketch brush. You could use any pencil brush you have, but I used the pencil sketch one included. And on a separate layer, I started to roughly sketch out the letters for the word wander. You don't have to get this perfect. It is only the first step of the process. Then on a separate layer, start to refine the sketch. Basically drew on top of it, but refining things as I go. So you can see how I'm not tracing everything perfectly. And I would also use the selection tool to move things around, use an eraser tool to maybe clean things up a bit. And usually when you're doing this, you might want to adjust the opacity of the underlying layer just so it's easier to see as you're creating your next sketch. So for this step, you really do want to take your time a little bit more just to have a more cleaned up version of your sketch. Next is to create the final shape of the word. For this one, create another layer, and using the brush pen, start to outline your initial sketch and create the final letters. This definitely was one of the longer steps in the process. You need to be precise, make sure you have straight lines and smooth curves, so take your time in this. Once this step was finished, it was time to create an outline layer in a different color. By the way, these colors were provided in a color palette from the class, the top 2 rows, but then I created this bottom row because I decided to go with a lavender background. But for the lettering, I still wanted to have the same gold chrome effect, so I used the same gold and brown colors to recreate that. So the main outline was this gold color, and then to create the outline, I used one shade darker on a separate layer. Now, I basically took too long on this step, creating the outline by redrawing it. This is how it was taught in the class. However, I've since learned that there are easier ways to do this in Procreate. So I would do a quick search here on YouTube to figure out how to do an outline layer that is much faster. At this point, we needed to add a background color, and I decided that I wanted to go with purple, so I have this light lavender color in the background. Next, we want to start creating some shadows. This involved duplicating the background layer and changing it to the darkest shade of brown, and then offsetting it to give this dramatic shadow effect. And then duplicating that same layer, but changing the color to a darker purple, and you can see how this one is a little bit blurry. That's because we used a Gaussian blur effect to create that. Duplicated that layer once more, applying more of that Gaussian blur to create that directional shadow. Because this is the source of the lighting from the top left, we want the shadows to come in this direction to the bottom right. So after the shape, outline, and shadow layers are complete, the bulk of the work is about adding shadows and highlights to give a realistic chrome effect. And again, all of this is done on separate layers. So one of the first layers created another one and made it a clipping mask that is attached to this main lettering shape layer. The main rule is that for the shadows, you want to use the darker shades of the color. And then for highlights, you want to use the lighter shades. So starting with the darker shade, and using a smooth details brush, you can see where I started to add these highlights. Here and here. Another thing to note, for most of these shadow layers, you'll want to change the blending mode to multiply. And then for the highlight ones, we change it to add. After adding these shadows, starting to add highlights. So on another layer on top of the main lettering, I used the lightest shade of the gold with the same smooth details brush, and you can see where I started to add these highlights on the edges of the main lettering and on the outline. So just as an example of adding it to an outline, you can see how adding these highlights starts to give it a shiny effect. You can make these random. You don't need to think too much about where they are, especially as you start to layer things on. You'll also want to play around with the size of your brush just to make sure it's not too dramatic. And then on another layer, added a few more highlights. You can see. And this one is following the direction of the light. So a lot of these I put on the top of the letter form since that's where the lighting is coming from. Then on a separate layer, started to add more shadows. So using the same brush, but because it's a shadow, we're adding the darkest color of brown. And you can see that I'm just adding them on edges of the letters. I know when you're creating this and everything is zoomed in, it doesn't look that great, but then you have to remember to zoom out every once in a while, and then you can see how the chrome effect is really coming into shape. So this is an iterative process, going back and forth, adding shadows and highlights. So on another layer, to add more highlights, use the add blending mode, and using the lighter shades of gold, you can see thinner lines along the outlines. Very subtle, but it helps add more highlights and glows to the letters. And then going again with the same idea for more shadows. You can see how the brush is a lot smaller here. Really simple, just going around the edges of the letters. Now we have a good amount of shadows and highlights on the lettering, but we need to make it blend in more with the background. So I added some highlights in a lighter shade of lavender to show the reflection of the background. So on a separate layer within this clipping layer mask, and having an add blend mode, using a lighter shade of lavender in the same brush, just starting to add those highlights. And you can see it looks like it's reflecting off of the background. And continuing to add more highlights, so on another layer on top of everything else, and you can just see how things really start to build, adding it in different places here and there. Using one of the smooth brushes to add a bit more highlights above the background. You can see how it's really subtle. But again, it helps make the lettering look like it's part of the background. Next, to add a little bit of shadow and highlights to the background, this layer goes above the background. You can see how it's adding a little bit of light here on the bottom. For that, I used the Smooth Blend brush with a light lavender color, and using the brush really large, just kind of spray painting over that bottom portion of the canvas. Then the same idea to create a shadow on the top. Everything is the opposite. So now we're going to use the darker shade of purple and have our blending mode on multiply, have a really large brush and just go over the top. So you can see a little bit of shadow and then a little bit of highlight. And you can see how these really start to add dimension and we no longer have a flat looking background. You might also want to play around with the opacity on these because this is what it looks like at full 100%, but that's definitely not what we want. So keeping it somewhere around that midpoint is going to make it look more natural. Now to add a little bit more dimension to the letters on a separate layer, using that light gold color, just adding more highlights on the letter, you can see the difference and how much more shinier that makes the letters look. Next is to add some sparkles. So for this, using the lens flare brush and the lightest shade of gold, adding a few sparkles in random places. So this is what I ended up doing. I did a large one here and then a couple of smaller ones over here, just so you can see what it looks like. You could adjust the size. Super small, it's a bit too small. Medium, super large. So you want to be really subtle with this, but you can see it really makes an impact on the piece. Next is to add texture to the background. Right now it's looking a little bit too clean. So using the dirt texture brush with the darker purple on a separate layer on top of the background, just going all over the canvas, you can see how it adds this texture to the background. When you turn it on and off, you can see the difference. At this point, we're just about done, but the last step is to add a little bit of noise and 3D effect. But when we're doing this, we need to duplicate our file because when you're applying these effects, you need to have a flattened layer. So I already duplicated this. First, we want to add some noise. Just so that you can see the effect, do it dramatically so you can understand how it works. But for this, you want it to be super subtle, probably somewhere around 5 or 6%. And you can just see it adds subtle noise to the background. And then the last thing is chromatic aberration. Again, you want to be super subtle with this, but just so you can see what it looks like. It kind of adds this 3D rainbow effect. So again, we're just going to go with about 5%. And that's the final artwork. And if you want to see the final time lapse from start to finish, this is what the entire process looked like in Procreate. So that's it, exactly how I created this lettering piece. Even though I followed along with an online course to recreate the 3D effect, everything else is exactly how I approach all of my design projects in general. If you enjoyed getting a look behind the creative process, I have a lot of other videos just like this on my channel, including these two here on screen that you might want to check out next.